The air in the city was thick that night, heavy with smoke and tension. As if every streetlight knew something was about to shift. Cameron had been pacing for hours, his mind spinning with words he hadn't shared before. Secrets that had been buried under years of loyalty, money, and performances. Every beat of the city seemed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. Fast, anxious, loaded. He knew the truth would change everything, and he wasn't sure if anyone was ready to hear it. Across town, Chrissy sat alone in the glow of her phone. Screen scrolling through the news, her patience fraying with every headline. She'd always been close to Jim Jones, but something had shifted. Small moments. A glance, a silence, a text that didn't make sense. People could see loyalty and love on the surface, but under it, tension was building like pressure in a sealed bottle. That night, she felt it. The city, the club, the very air whispered that something was coming that couldn't be ignored. Cameron's voice, when it came, was calm but edged with fire. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, was trying to reveal what had been kept behind. Closed doors. A story had been hidden from the world, one that involved promises broken, trust violated, and allegiances tested. He spoke of moments Jim Jones thought would never reach the public. Moments that painted a picture far darker than anyone could have imagined. Friends would shift, alliances would crumble, and the carefully built facade of unity would start to crack. Chrissy's phone buzzed again. A message from an anonymous source, one she couldn't ignore. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing screenshots, audio clips, and whispered confessions that tied directly to Jim's decisions, the choices that had affected her life, her career, and her peace of mind. Each message cut deeper than the last, and with every revelation she felt herself pulling away. Not because she wanted to, but because survival demanded clarity. The nightlife outside was oblivious, unaware of the personal apocalypse unfolding in dimly lit apartments and recording studios. Music thumped through nearby clubs, laughter spilled onto the streets, but inside Chrissy's mind, a storm was forming. Cameron had just dropped a truth bomb, one that demanded reckoning. And when truth strikes, there's no soft landing. You either face it or it reshapes everything around you. Meanwhile, Jim Jones carried on with his night, oblivious to the cracks forming beneath his world. He moved with confidence, greeted old friends, signed papers, and took calls. But the seeds of doubt had already been planted. Cameron's revelations were not mere gossip. They were pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, left only one clear picture: betrayal. And betrayal, once illuminated, leaves no room for pretending. Chrissy thought back to the early days, the smiles, the shared stages. The late-night drives through the city, the laughter and chaos that had once seemed unbreakable. But the picture now was different, and hindsight had sharpened every edge. She replayed conversations, texts, and decisions in her head, realizing that the loyalty she once felt had been fractured. Cameron's words weren't just exposing Jim. They were giving her a mirror, reflecting everything she had ignored. Each revelation came with a weight that couldn't be shrugged off. Names, dates, and alliances were no longer just stories. They were evidence, undeniable and raw. She thought about the friends who had stood beside her, the deals she had made, the time and energy invested in a relationship built on perceived loyalty. And suddenly, what had felt like certainty now felt like a trap. Cameron knew the impact of his words. He wasn't looking for fame or drama. He was telling a story that needed telling. A story about power, manipulation, and the consequences of decisions made in the shadows. For him, it was a responsibility, and he delivered it with the calm precision of someone who knew that truth, once released, could not be contained. Chrissy's heart raced as she absorbed the information. The city outside continued its relentless rhythm, but inside her apartment, time slowed. Every piece of evidence was a key unlocking years of blind trust. And with that clarity came a choice: stay and deny, or step away and reclaim her power. Her instincts screamed at her, urging decisiveness. She couldn't pretend anymore. Pretending had consequences, and consequences were already unfolding. The phone buzzed one last time. A video clip appeared. It was undeniable, caught in the moment. Raw and unfiltered. Jim's actions, previously dismissed or explained away, were now exposed with undeniable clarity. The truth wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a spotlight illuminating the fractures in relationships, loyalties, and trust. For Chrissy, it was the final proof. She understood what she had been avoiding. Some truths demanded action. The streets were still alive, but for Chrissy, the world had narrowed to a single point of focus. She stood, phone in hand, heart pounding, and made a choice that would alter the course of her story. Walking away wasn't easy, but staying in a narrative built on deception would be worse. And as she took a deep breath, leaving the apartment, behind the weight of Cameron's revelations settled like a storm cloud. Heavy but necessary. Outside, Cameron watched the city breathe. Knowing his words had set events into motion that couldn't be stopped, there was no drama, no need for theatrics. Just truth, flowing like a current that carried the powerless and the powerful alike. And as Chrissy disappeared into the night, it was clear the era of illusions had ended. Replaced by clarity, consequence, and a hard-earned awakening, in the quiet moments that followed, the city didn't notice the shift. Life went on, music played, and lights flickered in high-rise apartments. But for those in the know, everything had changed. Loyalties would be tested, alliances would crumble, and the fallout of Cameron's revelations would echo for months, maybe years. The game was no longer about appearances, it was about survival, truth, and self-preservation. And so, in the city that never sleeps, a new chapter began. One built not on fame or power, but on the unshakable foundation of truth. Cameron had spoken, Chrissy had listened. Jim Jones now faced a reckoning that could not be avoided. The stage was set, the players clear, and the consequences unavoidable. The morning sunlight did little to calm Chrissy's racing thoughts. She moved through her apartment with a mechanical rhythm, making coffee, straightening papers, checking messages, anything to feel a semblance of control. But Cameron's revelations clung to her mind like a shadow that refused to lift. Each detail, each piece of proof played over and over, and with it, the weight of choice became impossible to ignore. Jim Jones, unaware of the storm gathering, just beyond his perception, was already at his studio. Beats thumped through the walls, bass reverberating with an energy meant to drown out the outside world. He smiled at familiar faces, greeted collaborators with practiced ease, but his confidence, as solid as it seemed, was built on a fragile foundation. Behind closed doors, secrets festered, and for the first time, the world he had carefully curated was beginning to fracture. Word traveled fast in the streets and online. Cameron's hints dropped in interviews, social media clips, and whispered. Rumors were igniting conversations that could no longer be contained. People pieced together fragments of truth, filling gaps with speculation, amplifying tensions. A network of observers watched closely, some eager to see justice served, others waiting to witness drama unfold. But for those closest to the truth, the stakes were painfully personal. Chrissy found herself standing outside a building she once called familiar. Memories of laughter, arguments, and quiet nights inside the walls of shared experiences collided with the knowledge of deception. Her breath formed clouds in the crisp air as she clutched her phone, scrolling through every message, screenshot, and clip Cameron had sent. Each one confirmed suspicions she hadn't dared fully acknowledge, and with confirmation came clarity, painful, liberating clarity. Meanwhile, Cameron was strategizing, considering every possible outcome. He wasn't reckless. He had learned from experience that words once spoken could spiral beyond control. But truth had its own momentum, and he had released it carefully. Like a stone thrown into a still lake, knowing the ripples would reach places he could not. Yet see, every post, every conversation, every subtle reference was calculated to illuminate, not destroy. Yet destruction, when truth collides with deceit, is often inevitable. Jim Jones was about to discover this in the hardest way. His phone buzzed repeatedly, messages and missed calls piling up. The first inklings of unease flickered in his eyes as he read snippets of conversations he hadn't anticipated being seen. Friends who once smiled and nodded in agreement now looked at him with measured caution, their expressions tinged with doubt. A sense of isolation crept in, slow but undeniable. For all his power and reputation, he realized, perhaps too late, that influence is fragile when loyalty is tested. Chrissy's next move was deliberate. She called one of the few people she trusted, someone with a pulse on both her world and Jim's. Their conversation was terse, focused, and unflinching. There was no room for denial. Cameron's information had shifted the balance, and her decision to step away from Jim wasn't impulsive, it was strategic, a choice to reclaim her agency in a landscape built on control, manipulation, and performance. The streets outside seemed oblivious to the seismic shift unfolding in private spaces. Cars rolled by, pedestrians moved with purpose, and the rhythm of the city pressed forward. But for Chrissy, each step was weighted, echoing with the knowledge that leaving wasn't just about distance, it was about breaking a narrative, shattering assumptions, and refusing to be complicit in a story she no longer recognized. Inside the studio, tension thickened. Collaborators exchanged subtle glances, sensing the shift even if they didn't understand its full scope. Jim tried to maintain composure, but there was a crack in his demeanor, a tremor beneath the surface that betrayed the growing realization that the past, once hidden, had returned to demand accountability. Every phone call, every text, every rumor now carried the potential to unravel relationships built over years. Cameron's influence stretched far beyond immediate circles. Online communities dissected interviews, replayed clips, and analyzed posts with relentless curiosity. Social media became a courtroom where opinions, judgments, and rumors collided, creating a narrative that moved faster than any press release or public statement could. The city was alive with speculation, but the truth, as always, remained sharper, more piercing, and far more personal. Chrissy moved deliberately through the city, each step a metaphorical shedding of the past. Memories surfaced unbidden, shared. Laughter, quiet confessions, nights spent planning, arguing, dreaming. And yet every memory carried a shadow, a recognition that what she had once trusted had been compromised. The revelation of hidden truths, amplified by Cameron's careful disclosure, had transformed certainty into doubt, trust into caution, affection into careful calculation. Jim Jones, realizing the inevitability of confrontation, began preparing for the fallout. Strategies, apologies, denials, and explanations were considered, each weighed against potential consequences. The reality was stark. Public perception and private truth were diverging rapidly. And bridges he thought indestructible now teetered precariously. Control, he understood, was no longer entirely his domain. Cameron, observing from the sidelines, remained composed. He had acted not out of malice, but from a sense of responsibility, a commitment to reveal what had been obscured. His actions would ripple outward, forcing decisions, instigating change, and compelling reflection. For some, it would be painful. For others, liberating. But the trajectory was fixed. Truth had been released, and nothing could reverse the momentum. Chrissy reached the edge of the neighborhood where her history with Jim had unfolded. The streets carried echoes of old times, the laughter, the tension, the unspoken agreements that had governed interactions. And now, standing there, she felt the gravity of her choice crystallize. Walking away wasn't retreat. It was assertion. It was a declaration that her integrity, her awareness, and her agency mattered more than the comfort of illusion or the weight of expectation. Back in the studio, Jim felt the first tangible effects of exposure. Collaborators were hesitant, friends were reserved, and whispers grew louder. Kay, every action, every decision, every word was now under scrutiny. Kay, the world that had once seemed predictable, manageable, and controlled, now felt unstable, responsive. Only two truths he had once assumed were buried. Cameron knew this was just the beginning. Information once shared grows beyond the teller's control. Repercussions follow, sometimes slowly, sometimes with immediate impact. But the narrative he had set in motion was necessary. It was not about spectacle, it was about illumination. And as Chrissy stepped away, reclaiming her narrative, the boundaries of loyalty, trust, and consequence became starkly visible to all involved. Evening fell, casting long shadows across streets that had once felt familiar. Chrissy paused, reflecting on the journey from naive loyalty to informed independence. Cameron's revelations had not only exposed Jim, but also given her clarity. She could now navigate a world of fractured trust with eyes wide open, no longer tethered to illusions. The weight of the past remained, but the path forward was unmistakable. In the silence that followed, the city continued its rhythm, oblivious to the private upheavals it hosted. Yet in the hearts and minds of those directly involved, everything had shifted. Loyalties were questioned, alliances reconsidered, and reputations reevaluated. Cameron had spoken, Chrissy had acted, and Jim now faced the consequences of choices. Once hidden in shadow, the night deepened, and with it came a quiet reckoning. Truth, once revealed, reshapes everything it touches. And for those in the eye of the storm, there was no turning back. The game, once predictable and manageable, had changed forever. Every glance, every conversation, every decision now carried weight, and the consequences of exposure would ripple for months, perhaps years, across a landscape forever altered by revelation. Night had settled over the city, and the hum of distant traffic was a low, persistent reminder that life moved on even as personal worlds collapsed. Chrissy's apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in, forcing reflection. Every corner seemed to echo with decisions made, conversations remembered, and truths uncovered. Cameron's revelations had not only altered the perception of Jim Jones, but had transformed Chrissy herself. She realized that clarity comes at a price, and freedom, however necessary, carries the weight of consequence. Meanwhile, Jim sat alone in the dim glow of his studio monitors. The usual pulse of creativity, the energy that once fueled him, was now drowned beneath the rising tide of distrust and exposure. Collaborators had begun to distance themselves. Friends had pulled back, and whispers in the streets suggested loyalty was no longer guaranteed. Every message on his phone was a reminder that nothing could undo what had been revealed. The walls he had built around himself of influence, charisma, and carefully curated reputation were showing cracks. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. Chrissy didn't reach out. She had no intention of re-entering a space tainted by betrayal and false narratives. But the world around them forced collisions. Mutual acquaintances, reporters, and social media commentators amplified tensions, creating moments where silence could no longer serve as protection. Jim found himself confronted not by anger, but by the quiet, measured judgment of those whose trust he had taken for granted. The absence of his usual enablers became deafening. Cam's single quotes run, observing from the edges, remained a calculated presence. He understood the gravity of the truths he had set in motion, but he also knew the necessity of restraint. Revelation once released must be allowed to settle. Attempts to control its trajectory were futile. Influence was never absolute. He watched as consequences unfolded naturally, ensuring that the exposure of deception was complete, unadulterated, and undeniable. Chrissy's decision to step away was both literal and symbolic. She navigated the city with purpose, reclaiming spaces she had once shared with Jim, but now reinterpreting them as arenas of autonomy. Each interaction became a statement of agency. Friends noticed the change immediately. Her posture was firmer, her expression steadier, and her words deliberate. The gravity of truth, once fully realized, had empowered her to act with unwavering resolve. In the studio, Jim attempted damage control. Statements were drafted, social media posts prepared, interviews considered. But every effort to rewrite perception felt hollow. The story, once exposed, could not be rewritten. Attempts at justification, however well-intentioned, were drowned beneath the weight of fact, observation, and public scrutiny. Loyalty, he realized, could not be demanded. It could only be earned on. Much of what he had counted on had been eroded irreversibly. Cameron's strategy, meticulous and deliberate, was evident in the results. Public opinion, collaborators, and industry insiders had shifted. What was once an undercurrent of suspicion had become a visible, unavoidable tide. Chrissy's departure signaled a rupture, a tangible acknowledgement that deception, no matter how subtle, carries consequences. And as the ripple spread, others were forced to reconsider allegiances, question narratives, and navigate the new reality carefully. The streets themselves seemed to reflect the tension. Social media erupted with debate. Followers dissected every clip, every post, every subtle nod or wink from the parties involved. Interviews were analyzed repeatedly, statements scrutinized for inconsistencies. The city, a backdrop to both performance and authenticity, became a stage where reputations were constructed, deconstructed, and rebuilt in real time. The influence of exposure was unmistakable, and those caught in the center had no choice but to react. Chrissy, now fully in control of her narrative, addressed the few who reached out. Her tone was calm, assertive, and precise. She clarified her decision without malice, asserting boundaries and refusing to allow past betrayals to define her. In doing so, she established a template for autonomy, truth as a tool of liberation, clarity as a shield, and distance as a form of power. For her, the lessons of deception were transformed into strategies for self-preservation and future discernment. Jim faced his reckoning with varying degrees of resistance and acceptance. The dissonance between public perception and private reality was stark. Those who had once trusted him now approached cautiously, assessing sincerity against a backdrop of revelation. Attempts to normalize relationships were complicated by the residual effects of exposure. Every decision, every interaction became a negotiation with consequences that could not be ignored. Cameron, having set the events in motion, allowed the process to unfold organically. His role as both messenger and observer highlighted the intricate balance between intervention and detachment. By revealing truth without unnecessary embellishment, he ensured that accountability was earned through awareness rather than spectacle. The resulting clarity, though painful for some, reinforced the principle that actions have consequences. And deception cannot endure indefinitely. As days turned into weeks, the impact of exposure stabilized into a new reality. Chrissy's independence became evident to all. Her choices, once constrained by circumstance, now reflected deliberate, informed decision-making. Jim Jones faced ongoing challenges. His influence diminished, his relationships reevaluated. The industry, always sensitive to perception, adjusted to the altered dynamics. And throughout it all, Cameron remained a quiet catalyst, his intervention both precise and transformative in the final reckoning. Lessons emerged clearly. Loyalty is fragile, truth is unstoppable, and agency is earned through awareness and courage. Chrissy's departure was not an act of surrender, but of empowerment. Jim's confrontation with consequence was not vengeance, but inevitability. And Cameron's revelations, delivered with careful precision, illustrated the power of exposure to redefine narratives, redistribute influence, and catalyze change. The city, ever moving, absorbed the events into its rhythm, oblivious to the personal revolutions that had reshaped relationships, reputations, and trajectories. Yet for those involved, the experience was indelible. Choices had been made, truths revealed, and boundaries asserted. The reverberations would persist, shaping future interactions, alliances, and perceptions for months, perhaps years. To come. In quiet moments, Chrissy reflected on the journey. The clarity born of revelation, the empowerment born of action, and the liberation born of distance provided perspective. Cameron's intervention had been decisive, Jim's reckoning unavoidable, and her own choices transformative. The narrative, once dictated by deception and illusion, had been reclaimed, redefined, and redirected. As night fell again, the city's lights flickered like distant stars, indifferent to human dramas but framing them nonetheless. And in that quiet illumination, the story reached its natural conclusion. Truth had been spoken, autonomy asserted, and consequences endured. Each player, irrevocably changed, carried forward the lessons etched by exposure, reflection, and the unyielding passage of time.